When I was a young man in the early 60s, I was pastor of a small Methodist church in Wisconsin. And one Sunday after church, my oldest daughter, who was 5, asked me a very serious question. And I thought, that's awful serious for a 5-year-old, but she was my firstborn. So I gave her the answer, and it was rather complicated. She listened very carefully until the end when she said, "Now, Daddy, are you telling the truth now, or are you preaching?" So my assurance to you this morning will be that I'll attempt to tell the truth as far as I know it or understand it, and avoid as much preaching as possible. When I use the term connectedness, I do not mean simply connections, but the whole state, essence of being in the interconnectedness of life. Globalization is no longer debatable. When I can email a former student in India and expect an immediate answer within a matter of minutes, or when I can travel around the world by ship and plane in 40 days, that's physical globalization. Another globalization is obviously taking place which I would call a political economic globalization. One need only regard the moment of political repercussions of riots in Egypt to see how they connect with us. Or economic troubles in Greece, to be aware of the dimension of this globalization. But the dimensions of globalization impact a much more significant globalization taking place, which I call spiritual, personal, human connectedness of empathy. Which leads me to suggest that we've probably come to the divining point of history, by either soaring to the heights of human potential or falling into the chasm of despair and degradation. And it seems we're heading in a way down both paths. The path of new inventions, discoveries, deeds of kindness, however the other path of new wars, terrors, violence. Both of these points were regarded by Kierkegaard when he called them the either-or, when the human being, indeed all humankind, must make momentous choices amidst swirling energies, pressures, desires, expectations, of which many current events and thinkers are reminding us. Permit me to take a time capsule with one of those thinkers back 5 centuries before Christ. Peter Kingsley was a writer who brings us to the teachings of Parmenides and Empedocles. By the way, this won't be a test, so you don't have to remember those names. But I like the sound, Parmenides and Empedocles. It is important to learn the message they were expounding. The message was our senses, our personal senses, have led us astray by depending too much on our individual sense awareness, rather than embracing the totality of sharing the senses with the connectedness of the universe. And this means the whole cosmos. To quote the writer Kingsley, the usual idea we have is that meditation is to enlighten us, give us peace, or whatever. But for these people, meditation is not for oneself. It is an act of service for the sake of the cosmos. The purpose wasn't to get something out of it. It was to attune oneself to the cosmos for the sake of the cosmos. Kingsley feels that in misreading these Greek philosophers, we've been going down the wrong way for 2.5 millennia by ignoring the fact that the human race was not fully human and still today is suffering from the same misconception that Aristotle reminded us of our own self-awareness, and Descartes, of course, reminded us, I think, therefore I am. It's interesting, isn't it, that the only pronoun in the English language that's capitalized is I. Not you, we, they, it, she. Becoming aware of this led me to write The Glacier, which I have just read. The totality of the snowflakes which etches the face of the boulder. And when honoring the connectedness of the human enterprise, does not demean, is not meant to demean the individual's contribution. The arm severed from the body is not going to live very long, but the body without the arm isn't as effective as it might be. Aldo Leopold reminded us that everything is connected to everything else. However, we seem too often to be impelled outward by individual greed or withdrawn inwardly by personal fear. Too often we performers, and I'm a performer in addition to being a writer and a pastor, we think that we perform for self-expression. However, that's an insufficient reason to foist our self-expression onto the public if there's no need for celebration or understanding of that public to be shared in that art, be it music, theater, poetry, or whatever. Several years ago, I had the opportunity to choreograph and perform a poem, Childhood, written by August Derleth, one of Wisconsin's most famous and prolific writers. After my performance, his comment to me was, that may have been your childhood, but it wasn't mine. I had the temerity to answer this famous writer by saying, once you writers publish your work, it no longer belongs to you. It's like one of your children. If you want to keep it for yourself, simply put it away in a file and take it out occasionally and read it. It has no life of its own until it's let loose into the universe, where it makes its own connection with the cosmos. This leads me to reflect on a chalkboard lecture by Jeremy Rifkin. The basis of his presentation was to introduce the theory of mirror neurons. That was a new concept for me, but I was very fascinated by the term mirror neurons. That is, he attempts to explain the empathy we experience toward other people's misfortunes and pains. I've noticed when I see someone stumble, I have a similar feeling of alarm, as though I may have stumbled. Rifkin related the incident of a researcher tracking the brainwaves of a chimpanzee who had the difficult task of cracking a nut. While the chimp was still hooked up, a man came into the lab who was not part of the experiment, and he saw the nuts, and he started to crack one of them. And the brain waves of the chimp recorded the same thing as when he was attempting that same task. The lecturer reminds us that this phenomenon he calls the same emotion as the stumbler. We empathize with a character in a play or movie which the Greeks called catharsis. When we share the connectedness of the sympathy, it's what he would call mirror neurons or soft-wired. He maintains that humankind has evolved empathically in this way. In earlier times, our worlds were much smaller. We empathized only with family. The situation expanded, however, with shared language, expanded even further to city-states and then to nations and to religions, until finally the ultimate is globalization. And that's where we are today. According to him, we have evolved empathically for the potential of this connectedness. Unfortunately, we're still far from embracing a globally shared empathy, even though we've potentially evolved to do so. One might say to empathize is to civilize, or to civilize is to empathize. Years ago, Boccaccio, when he wrote the Decameron, started that great work with this statement: it is important that we all take pity of people in distress. We're all aware of our own emotions when earthquakes or floods or disasters occur in other parts of the world. The American response to the earthquake in Haiti was amazing. In a more disastrous, unfortunately for politicians have not always embraced our overwhelming concern and sense of horror. I thank Bob for reminding us of the horrors of this past week and to remember in our prayers. That too overwhelmed us. To restate Leopold's wisdom, everything is connected to everything else. It is no stretch to maintain that this empathy extends to all sentient beings. and indeed all living and inanimate objects. Certainly any of us who've ever had pets understands the shared empathy with a dog or a cat. And I'm sure you can very easily recall those incidents. I have a grandson who commits to an empathic relationship with his 11-foot python. When I tell him about rattlesnakes found here in our neighborhood, he says, "Oh, I hope they don't kill them." We don't have to have the same love of snakes as Clayton, but it would be good if we could respect them in our connectedness and understanding of sharing the globe with them. Everyone has examples of pets comforting us. When I was going through quite a trauma, my ex-wife's cat looked at me. He was standing on a chair. I was standing behind the chair. He put his paws on the back of the chair. He looked up at me, and with his velvet paws, he wiped my face. We all have instances of that with our pets. I've been amazed at the filmed examples of the adult female of one species mothering babies of different species, a mother dog feeding kittens. We've also seen examples of families of animals who seem to grieve over their dead ones. An example was an incident of bull calves in Africa. It was a part of Africa that had been depleted of elephants because of illegal poaching. So the authorities took calves up to repopulate. But when the young bull calves grew up, they had had no tutoring, no teaching by older males. So they didn't know how to behave. So they were marauders, they were rogues, and they had to be retrained because they were killing hippos. One of them could not be retrained, so they had to be put down. But when he was injected, his sister was standing beside him. As he started to fall, she tried to hold him up. But when he went down, she tried to get him up. She turned, the herd was leaving. She started to leave, stopped, turned around, looked at him as though to say goodbye, and left. There are many instances of that in the animal world. On a lighter note, it has been reported that a study had been conducted in which dogs empathize with their owners to such an extent that when the owners yawn, the dogs yawn. And even by hearing the sound of the yawn, they yawn. So we know that quite often we are in connection with our pets. Someone sent me a tape of an owl and a cat that were playing with each other, and after a while they even cuddled. And I thought, oh, the old nursery rhyme, The Owl and the Pussycat. I wonder if those children knew something. Surely it's easy to understand that living things are blessed with this empathic soft wiring of mirror neurons. But there's the material world. Several years ago, I had a mime school and a mime theater in Wisconsin. And we did a performance called Boxes, and each performer came out of a box. But out of one of the boxes, before the performer came out, a river rock rolled out. And then the actress came out, and it was obviously her pet. She tried to get it to follow her. It wouldn't, so she got a leash and put it around her, and she walked away. Of course, it rolled out of the leash, and it just was not paying any attention at all, so she took the leash and beat it. And when she hit that rock with the leash, the audience went, it was just a rock. But by that time, we had invested into the rock. Now, we're not always that invested into rocks. However, it is important that we understand the importance of the inanimate objects in our world. It's interesting also that this congregation supports biologic diversity, understanding that sense and importance of connectedness. And the connectedness is not limited to time and place. There's a renewed interest in genealogy. Some people spend hours and hours with genealogy, those gone on before. And also a growing interest in near-death experiences. I'm sure some of you have gone to some of the meetings we've had here in Tucson. And when Dr. Eben Alexander, who wrote a book, Proof of Heaven, he spoke to a group of people here in Tucson, and the room was so full, 150 over capacity, that they had to turn people away, because people were that interested in this experience that we're beginning to recognize as the near-death experience of not just what's gone on before, but what is out there beyond now. In northern India, the male Hindu devotees, in their religious ceremonies, dress as women. No, they're not transvestites. They dress as women to assume the role of the gopis, who were the milkmaids who tended to the needs of Lord Krishna. And by this practice, the Raganuga Bhakti Sadhana, they are making connections to the divinity, as the gopis had the closest relationship to the divine Krishna. In Asian theater, there are three audiences. There's the audience up there, which we usually think of as the audience here talking to each other. The most important audience in the Asian theater are the ancestors and the gods. Even if it's comedy, even if it's celebration, it's within that context. This brings us back to Rifkin's mirror neurons and Leopold's everything is connected to everything else. Could we be at the point where the prophet Isaiah saw, and the wolf shall dwell with the lamb, and the leopard shall lie down with the kid? That is, if we accept the reality with its repercussions, responsibilities of global connectedness. On the other hand, we might regard the warning of the great battle of Armageddon, the final warfare of humankind, when meaningful, empathetic connectedness is no longer honored. Perhaps this is the ultimate and only true choice of humanity, to embrace the evolution of this empathetic connectedness to the cosmos, or retreat into the more usual acceptance of the darkness or fear of egocentrism, of greed. We're all a part of making this choice, and we make these choices every day. One may wonder if we would be experiencing these recent national horrors if someone had reached out in a sense of empathy or compassion in any of these instances. An example of this empathetic connectedness is the prison ministry, in which some members of this congregation are volunteers. How we respond to people in our everyday life, how we treat the environment, how we connect with new people we meet in adverse circumstances, demonstrate our acceptance or rejection of our participation in this connectedness. Years ago, when I was studying in New York, I had the occasion, quite often, to ride the subway. And if you're in New York, you know you're not supposed to make eye contact with people. And particularly when you go down underground, you just look into space. But across the train for me was a little 5-year-old boy, an African-American boy, all dressed up with a suit, a white shirt and a tie, and black polished shoes, and he was with his grandmother and her friend. And of course, grandmother was obviously very proud of him. And he was alive, so I stared at him. And he was busy talking to his grandmother, And finally, the train came out of the subway to go across the bridge into Brooklyn, and in the sunlight, and the little boy went, "Wow! See, Grandma, what I told you?" The adults were, in 5 minutes we might be. If we accept the shared empathy of this global connectedness, we indeed may be able to share the wow with this 5-year-old.